Hi, thanks for joining us for the 2021 Google Ads API Migration Workshops. My name is Ben Carl, and I'm a Developer Relations Engineer on the Google Ads API. In this session, I'll be rewriting a small script that creates a complete campaign so that instead of using the AdWords API, it uses the Google Ads API. This session is intended to be a code along, and on our event website, there's a detailed code lab that you can use while following along. The code lab is quite extensive, but keep in mind that I'll be covering all the content in this video, so don't worry about reading it line by line while following along. Throughout this video, you'll see small figures like this that correspond to sections in the code lab. While following along, if you feel like you want to grab some of those code snippets to use in your script directly, you can feel free to do so. Now, a few more caveats. This session requires quite a bit of prerequisite work. That information was delivered during the workshop introduction. If you didn't get that information, if you didn't have time to go through the steps, or if you're coding in a language other than Python and have a hard time keeping up, feel free to sit back and just absorb the content and to revisit the video at a later date as a recording so that you can pause and go at your own pace. All of the high-level content here is intended to be language agnostic, so even if you're not writing in Python, you should be able to get a lot out of it. Lastly, there's a QA link at the bottom underneath the video where our team is standing by to answer any questions that you have while the session is happening. So let's get started. You can see here I'm at my terminal prompt. I'm actually inside of a clone of the Google Ads Python client library. You can see all of the files and directories here. The one that we're interested in is the examples directory. That's where the script lives that we'll be working on today. So I'm going to go ahead and just change into that directory. It's under examples/migration/campaign management. This location will be consistent across all of the client libraries if you're using a different language. And I'm going to go ahead and just list the files that we see here. The file that we're interested in is create complete campaign AdWords API only. And again, this will be consistent regardless of which library you're using. So in my environment right now, I have both the AdWords and the Google Ads client libraries installed, along with all of their dependencies. I have my configuration set up for both client libraries, which includes my OAuth credentials, my developer token, and a customer ID for a test account that I'll be using. And before we move on, I'm just going to run this file once just to see what it's doing right now without any changes. So you can see how it's executing, and reading through the logs, you can see that we created a budget, a campaign, an ad group, a number of ad group ads, and a couple keyword criteria. And if you look closely, you can see that this was all done with the AdWords API. Now, before we move on, I want to take a moment and go over some of the documentation that we have that will be used in this session and will also be very useful for you while you're going through your own migrations. So here we are at the Google Ads API documentation homepage. Notice up top here, there's a section all about migration. There's a lot of really good resources here that I encourage you to take a look at, but we're going to focus on just a few specifics right now. So if you click on the Services tab, there's a Migrating AdWords API Services page. What this does is it shows a mapping of AdWords API services to Google Ads API services. So what this means is in AdWords, if you're using the account label API service, when you do your migration to the Google Ads API, you'll start using the label service. If you go up and look at reports, go to the AdWords to Google Ads reports page, and we have a similar tool. This shows all of the individual reports in the AdWords API and what their equivalents are in the Google Ads API. And similarly, if you scroll down, it shows this mapping for each field in each report as well. Also for reports, there's a query migration tool. What this does is it gives you a field where you can paste an AdWords report query in AQL or AdWords query language, and it will convert it to a Google Ads query using GAQL or the Google Ads query language. Lastly, there's a section here called AdWords API features. This also is a mapping of each individual feature that's in the AdWords API and what its equivalent is in the Google Ads API. So this will point you to individual types and protobuf definitions in the Google Ads API. Now that we've taken a look at the documentation that we'll be using, let's start making some changes to the script. So remember, here I am in the examples directory that we're interested in. I'm going to open the create complete campaign AdWords API only file. So you can see here, this is a fairly basic Python file. There's some documentation at the top. We have a few import statements. Notice here is where we import the AdWords client library. There's a few global variables. And if you're using a language other than Python, these will probably be defined in a slightly different way. As we scroll down the file, we can see that there are a number of methods that are defined. This method creates a campaign budget. This method creates a campaign. And this one creates an ad group, and so on. And if we scroll all the way to the bottom, this is where everything is initialized. Here we create an AdWords client using the AdWords client library. Here we create a budget ID. Here we create a campaign ID, an ad group ID, text ads, and keywords. One thing to note, the method that we call on this line, load from storage, that reads a YAML file that's located in the root directory of my local machine, and it uses the credentials from that file to authenticate an AdWords client. We use a similar method when initializing the Google Ads client library. So now let's make some changes. So I'm going to go back to the top of the file. The first thing that we're going to want to do is to import the Google Ads client library. Now remember, I've already installed this client library into my environment, so all I need to do now is add an import statement for it. The path is similar, but slightly different than it is for the AdWords client library. So that should import the Google Ads client. The next change we need to make is to expose our test account's client customer ID in the script. So the key difference between the AdWords API, or I guess I should say one of the key differences between the AdWords API and the Google Ads API in terms of using the client libraries, is that the customer ID in the AdWords API is inserted via the configuration file. And in the Google Ads client libraries, the customer ID is passed into the service clients directly. So when we ran the script with using the AdWords API, my client customer ID was in the YAMLs file, and so we didn't need to declare it directly. But here we're actually going to use the ID in the script itself. So I'm just going to declare a global variable, and depending on which language you're using, you'll probably need to define this in a slightly different way. And I already saved my customer ID as an environment variable in my bash environment. One thing I'll need to do here is import the OS module so that this works properly. So the next step here is to initialize the Google Ads client itself. And to do that, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of the page and just add a new variable here. Oops, Google Ads client. So we're going to invoke the load from storage method, like I described earlier. And what this does, just like with the AdWords client library, it reads from a YAML file that's located in the root directory of my machine in order to obtain my OAuth credentials, my developer token, and so on. Now, before we go on, I want to go back to our API documentation and briefly discuss reporting in the Google Ads API. One of the key differences between the AdWords API and the Google Ads API is that in the Google Ads API, you use the reporting interface not only to retrieve performance metrics, but you also use it to retrieve attribute information for all of the entities in your account. And that includes campaigns and ads, ad groups, and so on. In the Google Ads API, all of the reporting goes through a single service, and I'm going to go to the documentation for it right now. It is called the Google Ads service. I'm just going to search for it. So in the Google Ads service, there are three methods, but two that we care about right now. One is called search, and one is called search stream. The main difference is that with regular search, you retrieve a paged response. So your responses come back in chunks, and those chunks by default are 10,000 rows each, but you can adjust the page size if you want. With a streaming request, the response comes back all at once in a stream. We typically recommend using search stream because it's faster, and that's what we're going to use when updating our script as well. Just keep in mind before we go back that our documentation has a whole set of resources for reports, both at the high level here and also in our migration specific section, and overall we have a number of reporting guides as well. So if you ever feel like you need more information, don't hesitate to come to the documentation and pick a section and read up. So the next step in our migration is to write a small method that we'll use to retrieve individual entities from the API. What this method is going to do is use the reporting interface in the Google Ads API to submit a search query using a Goggle query that we'll provide. And then it will return a single entity that matches that query. It's going to use the Google Ads service and the search stream method. So I'll start by defining a new method here. I'm just going to call it search Google Ads. And it's going to accept a Google Ads client and a query string. As I mentioned, this is going to be a Goggle query, similar to what we looked at in the documentation earlier. So the first thing I'm going to do is retrieve the Google Ads service from the Google Ads client. And we'll use the get service method on the Google Ads client, and we'll pass it the string Google Ads service. This just tells the client which service we want to retrieve by name. So next we will invoke the getStream method using the query and the customer ID that we've defined globally, and it's going to retrieve a stream. Just going to put this on a new line. So this accepts a customer ID, and we'll use the globally defined customer ID and a query. Now that we have the stream, we need to process it. And in the Python client library, that's done by simply iterating over it. And you'll see that this is done in our other examples in a for loop. And then each iterator variable that's returned in the loop is a individual instance of a Google Ads search stream protobuf message. But to save space, instead of doing that, we're just going to pass the stream to the list type, and that will force the stream to be processed all in one line. So I'm going to call this a response, and I'm just going to cast the stream to a list and retrieve the very first item from that list. And as I mentioned, this is going to be an instance of the search Google Ads stream response protobuf message type. And now from that response, we want to grab the first row. I'm going to create a little try catch here. The reason is that we want to account for any responses that don't have any rows in them. That means that whatever query that we provided to this method didn't match any entities. So we just want to grab the results field from that and grab the first row. And I'm going to catch any index errors, which indicates that we tried to retrieve an item from the list that was out of range based on the number of items in the list. And if that happens, instead of raising an error, we'll just return none, indicating that no results were found in the query. If you want a general example of how to use search stream in your client library of choice, I recommend looking at the get campaigns example, which is under the basic operations directory. And if you'd like an example of how to use the search method, which we reviewed earlier when looking at the documentation, I recommend going into the basic operations directory again and looking at the get add groups example. So now that we have our reporting method, let's get started migrating the first method. Now, here we have a method that creates a campaign budget using the AdWords API. And it's comprised of a few important parts. First, here it retrieves a service, in this case the budget service. Next, it creates a budget and sets the fields for that budget. In other words, it configures it. Here we create a budget operation. Here we submit the mutate request, and in the rest of the method, we parse the response. Lastly, we return the newly created entity. In this case, we return just the ID for the budget. Now, what's important about these steps is that they apply to all of the other methods in this script. And when you are doing your own migration and you're updating a series of mutate requests, you're probably going to be making similar changes as we are here. So just keep in mind these different portions of a mutate request. You retrieve the service, create the entity and set its fields, create an operation, submit the request, parse the response, and return the entity. So let's start here by retrieving a service. So with the AdWords API, we retrieved the budget service, and with the Google Ads API, we'll need to also retrieve a service. But I don't know off the top of my head which service that is. So let's go back to the documentation and go to the service guide that we looked at earlier that maps services. I'm sorry, wrong page. And let's look for the budget service. Here we go. So here's the budget service in the AdWords API. I can see here that in the Google Ads API, I need to use the campaign budget service. So here we will retrieve the campaign budget service, and we will use the get service method, just like we did in the reporting method above. And there we go. Since I've completed that step, I'm just going to comment the old AdWords code out. So the next step is to create a budget. Now, this portion is a little unique to the Python client library. Instead of initializing a budget directly, we're going to start by initializing a budget operation. The way that the protobuf messages are presented in the Python language, the entire entity itself is configurable, and so we just create an operation and then we can set the fields of the budget directly on that operation. If you're using a different language, it's likely that you will need to create the budget first and then set it on an operation. So we'll start by creating an operation. And again, I'm not sure what the name of that operation is. So I'm going to go back to the documentation. I'm going to check out the campaign budget service. I know I'm going to be making a mutate request. Close that. I'm going to check out the message definition for a request. I can see that this accepts a list of operations, and I can see that it's called a campaign budget operation. So back to the code, I'll just call this operation, and I'm going to use the client.getType method. Now getType is slightly different than getService in that the getService method retrieves a service client, and it initializes it by passing in a number of, passing our OAuth configuration so that it can successfully make requests. GetType just returns basic protobuf message types. So in this case, a campaign budget operation. And so next we want to retrieve the campaign budget off of the operation. So I'm going to go back to the documentation and look at the campaign budget operation. I can see it has a few fields here. One is the update mask, which we'll discuss later. The others are a create, an update, and a remove field. If you're creating a campaign budget, you would use the create field. If you're updating, use the update field. And so since we're creating, I'm going to use the create field. So I retrieve a budget by accessing the create field. I'm going to call this operation.create. And if you're using the Python client library, you'll see this pattern used throughout most of our examples. Now that we have our campaign budget, we can configure it. So that means we will set its name. I'm going to just name it, give it the same name that the other one had. I'm going to set its budget amount. One thing I'm unsure of is whether the field name is the same here. So I'm going to go back to the documentation, take a look at the campaign budget, and I can see that there's a field here called amount micros. So I'm going to go ahead and use that. And I'm going to give it the same value that we used previously here. Lastly, I'm going to set the delivery method. I can see that there is a delivery method field here, so I'm just going to go ahead and set that. So what's interesting about delivery method is its value is not a scalar type like an integer or a string. It's actually an enum. So there's only a narrow subset of values that it can represent. Now, with the Python client library, you can't just set this like this. This will not work. You actually have to retrieve the enum type that you're looking for from the client and use that to set it. And in Python, we have a way of doing that. It looks like this. This is called the budget delivery method enum. I'm just going to type that here, budget delivery method enum. And we want to use standard in this case. And so we set it like that. And so we've created an operation and configured the campaign budget on that operation. And so I'm going to go ahead and just comment this out for now. So the next step is to submit a mutate response. So similarly, I'll just name this response results, and we're going to use the campaign budget service, and I'm going to double check the name of this method. I'm going to come here to resources, campaign budget service, and I can see that this has a method called mutate campaign budgets. So the next thing that we're going to want to pass is the customer ID similar to the reporting method above. I'm just going to put this on a new line here. And then we pass a list of operations. I'm just going to put this one operation that we made into a list. So we can comment that out. And once we're done here, I'll go back and delete all the AdWords code so that it's a little bit cleaner. So now here we will have results. And the next step is to parse those results. So by default, when sending a mutate request to the Google Ads API, it will only return the resource name for the entity that you just created. And so a resource name is basically like a unique identifier for that entity. It's sort of like an ID that you would imagine from a database. There's a setting that you can use that will tell the API that you want the entire entity to be returned. We're not going to do that here, but we will take a look at that later on in this example. So for now, we'll just return the resource name and the results that come back. Actually, well, it's an object that will have a results field. We're just going to grab the first item from that list and get the resource name off of it. So now we have the resource name, and I can comment that out. Now, instead of printing this and just returning the ID, since we don't have an ID in this case, we have a resource name, I am going to use the reporting method that we wrote earlier to submit a query that uses this resource name as a unique identifier to retrieve the entire campaign budget that we just created. So I'll start by writing a query. I'm going to get the ID. I'm going to get the name. And I'm just going to get the resource name. And I'm going to retrieve this from the campaign budget report resource, and I'm going to filter it, excuse me, equals the resource name that we retrieved earlier. So now that we have this query, we can submit it to the API. So I'm going to use the search Google Ads method that we just wrote and pass in the Google Ads client and the query. And so remember that this method will submit that search request and parse the results and return a single campaign budget. Okay. Sorry, actually, I realized that we returned a Google Ads row here, not a campaign budget. In order to get the campaign budget, we need to retrieve it off of the row. Sorry. Campaign budget. And then the next step is to just return the campaign budget. So brief overview. We retrieved the campaign budget service. I'm going to delete this line. We created an operation, created a campaign budget using that operation, configured the campaign budget, submitted it to the Google Ads API via a mutate request, got the resource name for that newly created campaign budget. We wrote a GOQL query that will retrieve that individual that individual entity from the report interface. Here we retrieve a Google Ads row that contains the budget. We get the budget from the row, and then we return it out. I'm going to go ahead and just delete that. So the last thing that we'll do is go down to the bottom of this file. So remember earlier we initialized this Google Ads client. In this method, I'm going to replace the AdWords client with the Google Ads client. And then remember, instead of returning a budget ID, now we return a complete budget, but that budget does have an ID. So in the next method, I'm just going to change this so that we can run this example and it hopefully won't break. So let's give that a shot. And there we go. We can see, similar to what we saw when we first ran this, that we create a campaign budget, a campaign, an ad group, and so on. The only difference is that we use the Google Ads API instead of the AdWords API to create the campaign budget. So here we are using both APIs. Pretty cool. So the next step in our migration is to rewrite the portion that creates a campaign. So I'm going to open our script again and move down in the file until we get to the create campaign method. You'll notice that this method does all of the same things that the create campaign budget method did. It retrieves a service. It creates a entity, in this case a campaign. It creates a campaign operation. It sends a mutate request to the API, parses the response, and returns the campaign ID. So following that same set of operations, we'll make those same changes that we make to the create a campaign budget method. So we'll retrieve the campaign service. We will create an operation. And we'll initialize a campaign. And now we can start setting the fields on the campaign. And I'm just going to reference the values that are used previously in the AdWords API. So we set the name. We set it to interplanetary cruise. Hope I didn't misspell that. We set the advertising channel type. This is set to search. We set the status to pause. We set the bidding strategy configuration to manual CPC. Now, I don't exactly remember what the equivalent of setting bidding strategy type to manual CPC is in the Google Ads API, so I'm just going to go consult the documentation real quick. So here I am already on the campaign page. If I scroll down to the campaign bidding strategy one-of field, I can see manual CPC is what we want to set. That this is a one-of field, that means that only one of these fields can be set at any one time. So I'm just going to come in here and we're going to want to set enhanced CPC enabled to true. So manual CPC enhanced. Equals true. And we'll just continue on updating our fields. Campaign budget. I'm just going to jump down a little bit. Is the so remember here we're getting past the budget ID. Is the budget ID. Campaign start date. In Python, there's kind of a specific way that you need to format this. It requires the date time module. We are setting this to the start date of tomorrow. So datetime.now is right now, and then we're adding a delta of 1 day. And then we're going to do the same for the end date. Oops. End date. Okay. The only difference here is that we are going to set the end date as 1 year from now. Actually, I forgot to string format. We're going to use the string format that looks like this. And we'll do that in both cases. All right, so what are we missing? We've done the name, advertising channel type, we set the status, the bidding strategy, start date, end date, budget. Now we just need to set the network settings. Again, I'm going to go back to the documentation and just make sure I know what fields to set for the network settings. So we have network settings. Okay. These are Booleans. All right. So they're setting target Google search and target search network, Google search and search network to true. So network settings dot target Google search true. And then target search network also to true. So there we have it. We've created our campaign operation and created a campaign. Now let's submit the mutate request. So I'm going to name this response this time. So we're going to go campaign service dot mutate campaigns. And just like before, we're going to pass the customer ID and the operations. Here again, we're just passing a single operation. And we can delete this. Next is to parse the response. So we're going to get the resource name, response.results, grab the first result, and get the resource name. And just like with the campaign budget, we're going to use our reporting interface to retrieve the newly created campaign. So I'm going to get the campaign ID, campaign name, campaign resource name. I get this from the campaign where campaign.resource name is equal to the resource name that we were given in the response to the mutate request. So we'll retrieve a Google Ads row from the search Google Ads method. Once we have that row, we can grab the campaign directly off, and return the campaign. Next, I'm going to just delete this old code, condense these lines, and let's give the script actually, one more thing. Go to the bottom of the script. We're returning a full campaign now, not just an ID. So I'm going to delete that here when I'm passing an ID, the campaign ID. I'm just going to do that. And similarly here, instead of passing the AdWords client into this first method, I'm going to pass the Google Ads client. And now let's see if the script runs. Okay, we have an indentation error there. Great, let's go ahead and go fix that on line 110. Oops, that looks like an error. Okay. What do we have here? Campaign budget type is wrong. I see. So that ID needs to be a string resource name. Actually, I know what the problem is. So here, when we're passing the budget ID, we actually need to pass the entire budget. And what the campaign budget field here is looking for is not the ID, but the resource name. So I'm going to go ahead and make that change. And then also at the bottom of the file, instead of just passing this budget ID, I'm going to go ahead and pass the entire budget. So let's see if that works. So let's try running the script and see if it works. And there we go. Similar looking logs, except now I know we are creating both a campaign budget and a campaign using the Google Ads API. Well, now that that works, the next step is to create an ad group. So I'm going to go back into my script. I'm just going to search for the create ad group method, and same order of operations. We're going to find the service, create the ad group, create the operation, submit the mutate request, parse the results, and return the ad group. So I'm going to see if I can just cruise through these changes here for the second time. As I'm typing this line, I realize that there's an intermediate change that needs to be made to the method signature. So let's go up to the top here. Instead of a campaign ID, this method's now going to receive a campaign. Go to the bottom of the file, and instead of passing campaign ID, we'll just pass in the whole campaign. And instead of the AdWords client, we'll pass in the Google Ads client. So now here we can pass the resource name from the campaign, and we won't run into that same problem that we did with the last method. I don't remember what the equivalent for rotation mode is, so I'm just going to take a peek at that real quick. Ad group. Now that I think about it, rotation mode may be deprecated. Oh no, here it is. Ad group rotation mode. This looks like an enum. Okay, great. So client.enum, sorry, rotation mode. What was that again? Ad group. Add rotation mode. Okay. Rotation mode equals client. Optimize. Okay, so we've got our operation and our ad group together. Go ahead and just delete that. let's submit our request. I like to use response here. Add group service.mutate, add groups, same process as before. Pass a customer ID, pass the operations. We're going to get our resource name. And then we're going to use that resource name in a query. We're going to get add group.id, pretty similar to what we did before. Where add group.resource name is equivalent to the resource name. We're going to get our Google Ads row. Pass it the client, query, and then let's just return the Google Ads row.add group. All right, so we went through that a little fast. Let's see if it runs the way we expect. Actually, before we do that, I know of one change we do need to make. I'm going to go back down to the bottom of the file. Now we're dealing with an add group, not an add group ID. So I'm going to change that to an add group. And then in these next two methods, I'm just going to pass the ID rather than the entire group. So let's see if it runs. We got something. Okay, that doesn't look right. A tuple. Let's go. That's on line 149. Take a quick look at that. Should be simple. Ah, yes. That's a basic mistake. I don't need one extra parenthesis there. And there we go. Key error type, I see. So this is an issue that's specific to the Python client library. Oops, the add group type it needs a trailing underscore here. This is not an issue that you'll encounter in any other language specific to Python. And if you are writing in Python and you're curious why this is an issue, I encourage you to go look at our client library specific documentation, and it'll explain why we do this. All right, so let's see if this runs now. And there we go. So now we're creating a budget, campaign, and an ad group with the Google Ads API, and then we're creating ads and ad group criteria with the AdWords API. Now let's go in and update the method that creates ads. I'm going to go down to the create text ads method. So a quick overview here. Same as the other methods, we're getting a service. The difference is we're creating a list of operations rather than just one. Recall in the previous methods, we just passed a list directly into the service call. We're creating text ads in a loop here, and then passing that mutate operation to the API. I am going to start refactoring this, and again, I'll probably do it just a little bit quickly for the sake of time. Now we've refactored the section that creates a list of add group add operations in a for loop. The next step is to refactor this line that sends a mutate request using the add group service. This is actually going to be the add group add service. There's a little bit of a typo here. I'm just going to fix that real quick. So I'm going to do something a little bit different here with this mutate request. If you remember earlier in the session, I mentioned that you can specify a header in your requests that will tell the API to send an entire entity back in the response and not just the resource name. So in order to do that, in Python, you actually need to initialize the full request object outside of the service method instead of just passing in individual parameters. So I'll show you how to do that using the getType method on the client. So this is going to be called an add group add request. Add group add request. Oh, sorry, I meant mutate add group adds request. So now that we have this request as a separate entity, we, instead of passing the fields in that we would normally pass in, we're going to just set them on this request object directly. So customer ID, add group, add request operations is set to operations. And then the next field that we're going to set is called the response content type. Request response content type. I'm going to set this to response content type enum, and the value will be mutable resource. So what this means is when we get our response from the API, it will have a list of add group adds, not just the resource names. And the reason I do that here is since we're not returning an entity from this method, I'm just going to retrieve the entire entity so that we can log it here. So I'm just going to change the name here. This is going to be mutate add group adds, and instead of the parameters from the other methods, we're just going to pass in the add group add request. And now I'm going to just update the log line here. Paste that in. And let's see. Actually, I see one more change I need to make up here. Add group add dot add. This should actually be appended like that. Oops. All right, I think this should work. Let's run it and see what happens. And there we go. Now we're creating text ads with the Google Ads API, and all that remains are keywords. Here we go. Let's start. I'm just going to go down to the file. I'm going to do this real quick and go to our keywords method here. The changes here are going to be pretty much the same as the ones I made for creating text ads, the keywords are created in a loop. We're going to create the response message outside of the service method so that we can define the mutable resource header, and then we'll use the entire entity that's returned from the mutate request in the log statement. So again, for the purposes of time, I'm going to go ahead and just make these changes pretty quickly. And I think that should about do it. Let's give the script a run and see if it works. Forgot to replace the client. One last time, let's see. On line 255. I see. That should hopefully do it. I see. We've got too many lines here. I'm just going to get rid of this one. There it goes. It worked. So we've successfully migrated this entire AdWords script to use Google Ads. And now this version might be a little disorganized since I did it live. So if you want a more complete reference, I recommend going back to remember the list of files in this directory. And if you look at the create complete campaign Google Ads API only, that will give you a similar version of what we just wrote, in that it creates the complete campaign using only the Google Ads API. And that will do it for the session. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you learned a lot. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the developer relations team, either via our support channels or by leaving a question directly on the GitHub repositories for any of our client libraries. Thanks again. Take care.